I'm creating a relaxing photography game where you're stranded on an alien planet, study alien wildlife, and find out how you got there. I'm taking inspiration from a few games. First, A Short Hike, because I like the way it lets the player explore the world completely freely. Then, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, for mostly the same reasons, although my game will of course be much smaller. And finally, Rain World, because I love the ecosystem and how alive the world feels. Forgotten Journey, as I'm calling it, won't be very similar to any of these games, but certain aspects of it are inspired by the games mentioned. The first thing I did was get the camera system working, since this was the only part of the game that I wasn't even sure was possible in Unreal Engine. Luckily, I got the core system working in less than a day, as you can see here. This proves it's possible. But I want a photo book to look at all the photos you've taken so far. This was pretty easy to set up, apart from the fact that I can only save images, not delete them. So when you click delete in the photo book, the photo won't be shown in game, but the PNG will still be in your game folder, until you take another photo and it gets overwritten. Next, I added camera settings, so the player can change things like exposure, contrast, saturation, depth of field and much more. I had some problems with the clouds glitching out when the game is paused, so right now the game is just set to 0.001 time dilation, instead of completely pausing. This isn't optimal, so I'm still looking for a better solution. Later on, I also plan on adding unlockable filters, but that's not a priority right now. Now for the next big part of the game, the creatures. All the creatures in the game are children of one parent blueprint. The main way different behavior for different creatures is achieved is with data assets. Every creature has its own data assets, which will determine just about every aspect of how it interacts with the world, other creatures and the player. Speaking of creature behavior, I added a bunch of things. Eating foliage, drinking, hunting, fleeing, sleeping and much more. All of these things can be individually tweaked with the data assets. I made a new movement type called flying, which obviously means it flies from location to location, which is a lot more complex than it sounds, but I won't bore you with the details. Oh, and as you can see here, they also land on branches sometimes. This is pretty good, but right now they just look at the player and run away when they get scared, which is boring. And I want to add a lot more interaction between the player and the creatures. So let's get started on that by creating a list of pictures the player needs to take to study a creature. Right now the UI is mostly a placeholder, but it does work as you can see here. The player needs to take photos of the creature doing different things to learn more. Once the checklist is completed, they unlock more information about that creature, including what you can use as bait. But to do this, I'm first going to need some animations and a first-person mesh. So let's head over to Blender and start designing a spacesuit. There are a few reasons I chose this. I don't have to model a head or make facial animations. It makes sense with the story and setting. And finally, I think spacesuits look sick, so obviously I'm biased. Modeling this was a lot of fun, but I have much less experience with texturing. And this was my first time using Substance Painter. Although it took some time to get used to, I quickly got the hang of it and I'm very happy with the final textures. Things like the stitches and decals were just so much easier than in Quixel Mixer, for example. I made a bunch of first-person animations and used a 2D blend space for the legs. One axis represents the movement speed and the other the movement angle. Each of these dots is an animation, and Unreal Engine simply blends between the two closest animations, depending on the two values provided. Once the inventory system was done, I was able to pick up objects or harvest different plants and then put them down or throw them. The plants also grow back after some time, which is currently represented by the brightness of the material. These items can now be used as bait if used on the right creature. Right now the creatures will just eat the bait and move on, but I'm going to make this way more interesting in the future. Now I want to finally get the environment looking a bit better. For the ground foliage I used mostly Quixel assets, which I spent a ton of time optimizing. In the end I was able to not only make them around 5 times more performant, but also drastically decrease LOD popping. This uninteractable ground cover foliage is spawned automatically using grass maps, which means the performance is great, but there is no way of interacting with them. I used Speed Tree to make 3 different kinds of trees, and quickly generate different variations of them. There's the large detailed trees with hanging vines and branches for birds and other flying creatures to sit on. Next, there's normal sized trees, which are simpler and don't have hanging vines. And finally, palm trees. For the foliage we need something alien. because right now this could just be a rainforest. So I made a bunch of different alien-like foliage and added this to the foliage I already had. These mushrooms also glow in the dark, which is really simple, but I like how they look. The day and night system isn't that complex, although getting the lighting to look good while maintaining performance was a struggle. The much more time-consuming task was the global weather system, since almost all of these meshes have different materials and I need them all to be affected by the global wind and wetness. Making objects look wet is simply a matter of decreasing the roughness, so it's not very difficult, it's just I had to go through and add this to all the different parent materials. It was worth it though, since I love how the storm looks now. These two test creatures aren't enough, so I create two new ones. A turtle-like creature that hides when scared, and a large pterodactyl-inspired creature. I really love modeling and texturing these creatures. Even the animating is okay. The only part I wish I could just skip is retopology. Then again, I've never heard of a single 3D artist who enjoys retopology. Finally, I want to add one of the many crashed spaceship parts the player comes across. I decided to create the jet engine. I made sure to add many details, as I knew I wanted this to be really big, so it has to look interesting. I thought of creating the textures for this in Substance Painter, but decided not to because of two reasons. One, making each of these materials by hand takes a lot of time, and since I'm alone, I want to save time where I can. And two, much more importantly, one large texture stretched across such a huge model would be very blurry when the player gets close, even at high resolutions. Instead, I will be taking a bunch of tiling textures and blend these together. Here's what the material does. The first texture is peeling paint, which blends with rust at the edges of the model where the paint would have likely completely peeled off. Using the vertex normals, I made moss always grow on top of the model. And finally, there's dirt in the crevices. This approach is highly performant, looks very good in my opinion, and requires minimal manual work. Next, I started set dressing by adding rocks, ship parts, plants, and more to the wreckage. I thought some large vines would look cool, so I made this blueprint which automatically adds smaller hanging ivy to the larger vine, making it easy to add interesting looking vines. I'm happy with what I've got now, but there's still a lot to do. Camera effects, rideable creatures, making creatures follow the player, a water system, and underwater creatures. If this interests you, consider wishlisting the game on Steam or subscribing. Until next time, bye.